Okay, good afternoon. Nice to see both of you. I hope that your school year is going okay so far. So this presentation is primarily geared towards world languages teachers, but there will certainly be information of value in here for ESOL teachers as well, I hope. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, the formatting changed. That's odd. Should be okay on the next one. Yep, here we go. Okay, so today's learning objectives are I can define and identify examples of cultural appropriation, and I can support my students in learning about it and how to avoid engaging in it. So as I always do when I'm teaching, I also am trying to be intentional about pulling out key vocabulary in my teacher training presentations. So here are some of the words that might come up in our conversations today that might be of value to you. So first, culture, and I think we all have our own understanding of what culture means, but this is one definition that you could consider using, which talks about the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a group of people. And then cancel culture, which I'm guessing you probably have heard in the news or in social media here and there, which refers to this idea of canceling a person or an institution because of some kind of wrongdoing that they may have done, something that feels politically incorrect or unfair to a certain group of people. To appropriate means to take something for your own use, usually without permission. And I think we're all quite familiar with stereotypes. And then power dynamics will be a really crucial element of the conversation around cultural appropriation. And that's how power works in a particular setting. And then intent versus impact is also a really key concept when talking about cultural appropriation. And that's the idea that whatever a person's intention may be, it does not wipe away or undo the impact of their actions. All right. So correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole, you are in the ESOL program, correct?
Yes.
Okay, but Selena, these are probably quite familiar to you. So these are our actual world readiness standards for learning languages that world languages teachers tend to apply. So for you, Nicole, these might not be something that you're quite as familiar with because WIDA's focus in the English language development standards is different, certainly. But in the ACTFL standards, there is a focus both on language and culture. So as language teachers, we are charged with making sure that our students acquire language through cultural experiences, and language is necessarily embedded in culture. So when we try to teach culture, we all want to make sure to do our very best to do it sensitively. And many world languages teachers in Maine are teaching a language that is not their primary or first language that they've learned through schooling. There are certainly teachers who are teaching their primary language as well. But it is a little bit of a tricky thing to navigate to be sure that we're handling culture in a sensitive way. So these three standards or goal areas from the ACTFL standards pertain most directly to the teaching of culture. And they call on us to really teach those deeper aspects of culture. And I put this image over here on the right, which you may have seen a variation of before, which is about surface culture as compared to deep culture. So the ACTFL standards are really calling on us to probe into deep culture. Of course, surface culture types of things are engaging and fun and important for students to learn about as well. But it's the deep culture that these standards are really pointing towards in allowing students to understand how people think and operate in a given culture. Okay, so just to get us going, I've pulled out 4 images that you might have seen before, again, in the media or in social media. And I'm going to, I had a poll prepared, but I think because there are just a couple of us, we can just discuss them together. So as I show each image, I'd like you to think about whether you would consider that an example of cultural appropriation or not. And then if you can be ready to explain why, that would be great. So here's the first one. What are your thoughts? First of all, do you know the context of the image and the symbolism that's here? You know who this is? Do you recognize the person or not?
Selena Gomez, right?
It is indeed, yep. And do you recognize the symbolism in the image?
No.
Or the cultural elements that she is? Oh, I can't hear you, Selena. Were you speaking?
The one she has in the front head?
Yeah. Is anyone familiar with what that is?
Well, I see some people from India using it when they married.
Mhm.
They use a red dot, but I don't know the whole thing about
Yeah.
that.
Anybody else have information about that? No. So I certainly won't claim to be an expert. I know that it's referred to as a bindi, and it's part of the Hindu culture and religion, but I don't know exactly what it's meant to signify. So just knowing a little bit that you do about Selena Gomez and about the origin of this cultural element, would you consider this cultural appropriation?
Can you define cultural appropriation, please?
Yeah, we're going to define it, and that's a great question. But I thought it might be of value before we really get into what it is and what it isn't, to just kind of check in our guts whether this feels appropriate or not. Is it okay for Selena Gomez to wear a bindi or not?
Probably.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
I think if you don't know really the meaning of it, it's hard to have an opinion. For me,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, it's okay because she is kind of like embracing the culture, but if it's something very special for them that just certain people can use it and probably they're not okay with it. So because I don't know the real meaning about it, is just very hard to give an opinion of it.
Yeah, that's completely fair, Selena. And that really speaks very much to the discussion we're going to have in a few minutes about what the distinguishing features of cultural appropriation are. And you've kind of touched on some of the important things right there. Okay, let's try the next one. So first, do you recognize the person? It's Angelina Jolie. And do you recognize the cultural elements that are present in this picture? So would you, as a gut reaction, would you say that this is or is not an appropriate use of those cultural elements?
I say probably not.
Yeah, there's so much context that we'd like to know, right? Like,
Yeah.
what questions would you want to be able to ask to determine whether this is or isn't appropriate?
I would want to know where she is,
Yeah.
because I think that would make a difference on why she's wearing it and if that's okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I would like to know as well, because certainly if she were visiting a mosque, then this would not only be okay, but it would be really respectful and necessary even for her to cover her head. Okay, let's try the next one. So this is not a famous person, but what's your gut reaction? Is it okay for this person to be using these cultural elements? And do you recognize the culture that is being portrayed here?
Is it German?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
You're right.
Not that far.
Oops, we have one more person in the waiting room. So what do you think?
Again, everything depends of the context of the situation and
Yeah, so what questions might you want to know the answers to, Selena, to be able to judge this one?
Why he's doing that, for what purpose? I don't know. It's like a Mexican person with a sombrero. I mean, we don't wear sombreros all the time, but we see them in Cinco de Mayo everywhere around,
Yeah.
the States. So I do not get offended. I think it's kind of funny and fun.
Okay, yeah.
So
Well, that's a great segue into our next one. Because this is one of those that shows up really often. People are talking about whether it's okay to represent Mexican culture in this way, and kind of isolate that one thing that is really not all that common in day-to-day life. So what are your thoughts about this picture?
I think it's funny,
Yeah.
but I think it's real. I mean, I married with an American guy, and I know what he thought about us when he went to Mexico. Probably he thought my dad will come after him in a horse with a hat or
Right.
something like that, and we don't own a horse or a hat. And so I don't know. I think this depends how you take it, and I feel like they want to be honoring the Mexican culture that way. And I don't think we can get offended. In Mexico, we use it for a special occasion like Mother's Day, Independence Day too. So I see it as a way to celebrate the culture.
Okay.
But it's important to mention that it's not like that,
Yeah.
like.
Right, that's the context piece that's crucial to knowing whether something is or isn't appropriate. And this reminds me, I don't know if you all saw, it was a group of Spanish teachers who, for their yearbook, all dressed in a poncho and a sombrero and fake mustaches. Did you see that in the news? There was a big uproar about that because members of the community felt that that was not an appropriate cultural representation and that it was offensive. So this is kind of in that line, but again, we need more information probably to be sure about what this is really, what's really going on here. But it looks like they're in a school, so I would assume these are probably Spanish teachers. Okay, so are you familiar with Menti? Have you used that maybe in your classes or in trainings? No, okay, so it's very simple. All you need to do is open your browser and go to menti.com, and it will prompt you to enter this code. Where there are just a couple of us, this is a word cloud that we're creating, so please feel free to pop in as many words as come to mind when you think about what should be included in a definition of cultural appropriation. So I'll give you just a minute or two to pop in some words. Let me know if you're having any trouble getting into it. Have you entered some words and they're not showing? Or is there any trouble on your side?
I don't honestly know what words to write.
Okay, that's
because
fine.
I don't think I quietly understand what the definition of cultural appropriation is.
Okay, that's fine, Selena. I think some of the things that you've said so far in this training have really hit the nail on the head. So I think you have a better understanding than you might realize of what the definition is, but that's absolutely okay if you don't want to enter any words right now. Nicole, do you have some words to put in there, or should I move on from this activity perhaps?
I am not certain either.
Okay, that's okay, no problem. If there were a bigger group, then this would probably work a little better. Okay. So I will then show you a couple of definitions that have been created by others, and we can reflect on those together. So the Oxford Dictionary defines cultural appropriation as the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas, etc. of one people or society by members of another, and typically more dominant people or society. And then the Oregon DOE has this other definition that I thought was an interesting contrast, which says cultural appropriation is the adoption of the elements of another culture, often a minority group, by members of the dominant culture. It is an unequal exchange in that the appropriators often use these stolen elements for monetary gain or prestige without regard for the value, respect, or importance paid to these images and traditions in the original culture. So they're in essence saying the same thing, but the Oregon definition goes on to explain that a lot of times that cultural appropriation is done and benefits the person who's doing it monetarily. So can you think of any examples of that you might be familiar with, where someone has appropriated elements of someone else's culture and they've gained financially for it?
Selling art.
Okay, tell me more.
Selling art from the other culture as an original art from certain culture, clothing.
Yeah, clothing is a huge market for that. Designers who may not have any relationship to the culture whose elements they're using create clothing that includes those.
I think it happened just not long ago. I think last year, when a very well designer decided to put some like Mexican well-known, how do you call it? They do it by hand.
Embroidery.
And people in that indigenous community was not happy because she was making money from something they've been doing for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And signing has her own.
Mhm.
So she has to take out that whole line of clothing.
Yeah, that's a great example, which is similar to one that was actually in the news quite recently. If you're familiar with the Minnetonka Shoe Company, they make native inspired shoes like moccasin designs. And a lot of people might have assumed that the Minnetonka Company had some basis in the indigenous community or was even owned by indigenous people, but in fact, it has no connection at all. And so the, I don't know if he's the CEO, but some person in the leadership of Minnetonka has spoken and said that they are sorry for doing that and for profiting from it for a very long time, making lots of money off of these native inspired designs, and that they intend to move forward by partnering with native communities and giving appropriate credit where it's due. So that's just one example that came out, I think, within the last week or so. But if you Google cultural appropriation in the news, you'll find dozens and dozens of stories just like that.
You know which one is a very good example?
Mm.
The cultural appropriation, Cinco de Mayo.
Yeah.
We do not even celebrate Cinco de Mayo in Mexico the way it's celebrated here. I didn't even know exactly what it was very well when I came, and everybody thinks it's an Independence Day, and a lot of restaurants and everywhere around take a lot of money from that. That is not even the independence, but in the same time, it's the time to honor the culture. So, you know.
Yeah, right. And I'm curious for people who are teaching Spanish as a second language, how they address that or don't address it in Spanish class. It seems like a good opportunity to talk about just what you described here, Selena, that it's something that is misinterpreted, misunderstood, and misapplied, and that it benefits people without any real reason for it. Yeah.
Well, I celebrate it too, but I try to celebrate the culture and make sure they know it's not Independence Day, that we
Yeah.
don't celebrate the way it's here, because I think it's very good opportunity to know the culture,
Yeah.
but is misunderstanding the whole thing. And
Okay. Often you'll hear in any conversation about cultural appreciation, appropriation, you'll hear the contrast with cultural appreciation. So that's kind of what you're talking about as well, is that there's no element of a culture that you can't address in some way in your class. You can talk about anything and you can represent anything, but with respect, right? So these are kind of some of the hallmarks of each kind of thing. So cultural appropriation usually involves limited knowledge or respect for the cultural product or practice. It also involves an imbalance of power. So if you refer back to those couple of definitions we looked at, they both talked about members of the dominant culture or the culture with greater power in whatever context, using culture's symbolism or elements of that culture that are not from the dominant group. And then cultural appropriation also typically has a negative impact on the members of the culture that is being appropriated. So again, that's that intent versus impact piece, that even if you mean it in a good way, you're trying to just honor the culture, or you think it's fun or cool. If it's hurtful to someone who is a member of that culture, then that probably isn't the right way to go about it. Versus appreciation, which is rooted in deep understanding and respect for the culture. And when someone is appreciating another culture, they're typically recognizing and expressing that they understand their stance as an outsider of that culture. They're not trying to portray themselves as a member of that culture. And they're appropriately crediting and benefiting the source of the cultural element that they're using. And usually it's not perceived as offensive because it comes from that place of respect and understanding. Okay, so I normally would have broken us into groups, but with this size, how many actually do we have? Just a moment. Okay, yeah, I think we'll just stay whole group for these as well. So I've made up a few scenarios that to me seem fairly realistic, like these probably do happen in classes. And we can just reflect for a minute on now, with our understanding of the definition of cultural appropriation, whether these would be examples of it or not. And you may find yourself saying, we need more information here as well. So kind of think about the questions that you would want to ask to be able to make a determination. So the first one is, a French teacher has students choose traditionally French names for themselves to be used in class. So first of all, is this something that teachers do? I can tell you they used to, at least, because when I was a French learner in school, I was made to choose a name, and my name was Nicole Nautique. I still remember very clearly, and everybody had a name. And it seemed like good fun to us. Is it good fun or is it inappropriate? What do you think?
I don't know. I don't know if they still do, because like you, when I was in French, we had to pick names as well. And I didn't think much of it. I just don't think it serves a purpose. It's not a super deep culture thing to need with just a name. So
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
that's a very good point, Nicole, about what purpose is it serving? Is it teaching the students really anything about French culture to do this? It's great for them to have awareness of the variety of names that that Francophones may have. But the other part of that is traditionally French names. Are we implying that French speakers always have those traditionally French sounding names and that those are the names of real French speakers? Because we certainly don't want to imply that, right? Any other thoughts on this one? All right, then the next one is, a Spanish teacher comes to class in sugar skull makeup for Dia de los Muertos. Appropriate or not? Or what else would you need to know to be able to answer that?
I say no.
Not appropriate?
I know it is appropriate
It is appropriate, okay.
because it's how we celebrate in there. And if you know the culture, you know, we have parades with it. It's kind of what we do, and it's a way to teach them that, and depends how she use it. But we do ofrendas even in my classroom, and in the school we do competitions of ofrendas, and I don't think they're appropriating the culture. They just learning about the culture with respect and fun, because it's a fun activity, and a fun is my favorite celebration in Mexico. So I think it's appropriate, but I don't know.
Well, if we look back at the way we defined appropriation versus appreciation, I think there are some keys there for us to decide that. Before I say anything more, though, it looks like Beatrice has unmuted. So is there something you'd like to say?
Well, I was just going to say that I like that Selena said that that's the way they celebrate it in Mexico, because it's just in Mexico. In South America, we don't do that. I'm from Colombia. It's just a holiday. It's just that all October is like the month of children. So we do the whole month activities for children, which includes dressing up. But then it's just November, the 1st, that we go to church, and that's it. But all those, the bread and all those stuff is a Mexican thing, very elaborated and pretty. But I learned when I came here to this country that it was so popular, as well as the Cinco de Mayo. I learned it here because, as she said, it's Mexicans don't even know what it was.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is that an appreciation for this cultural element that comes with learning about it and what the meaning of it is and the history of it is, and also learning that it's done this way in a certain place and maybe differently in another place.
And
that can be, oh, go ahead, Selena. Yeah.
I think that is the point. Like, depends how you do it. If you just do the makeup for no reason, but if you want to teach behind that, like, for example, like she said, I mean, and I don't want other Mexicans think like, no, we know about what Cinco de Mayo is, because some of them they knew. I didn't, but they probably do. Well, it's just in Puebla, it's a state that celebrates more Cinco de Mayo. So in Puebla, it's a big deal. It's like Pennsylvania, for example, have a celebration, but I didn't have, it's not an official celebration. Everybody's working, everybody goes to school. It's nothing big for just Puebla, just to make sure. But if you, like when you were saying the teachers going on TV with these big dresses and sombreros, what was the purpose of it, right? Because I use that in Cinco de Mayo for dancing folk dance, Mexican folk dance. And I make sure they know we do that for Mother's Day, for example, or we dress like that as in Independence Day. So I think it depends of the purpose of what you use in the makeup and the dressing. It will depend if it's appropriate or not.
Great. Yep. So the context, the well-roundedness of the information that's being presented, the framing of it by the teacher, making sure that students understand the significance of it and the teacher's relationship to that culture. Because as we started this presentation saying, we have some teachers who this is the culture that they bring to the classroom, and so they can share that as a member of that culture. And then other teachers who are, like their students, learning about Spanish-speaking cultures and need to make sure to frame it that way, that they are admirers from the outside rather than participants. Okay, the third one, an Arabic teacher models different fashion for Muslim women, including hijab, niqab, and abaya. And just to make sure we're all clear on what those terms are, hijab is the headscarf that we saw Angelina Jolie wearing. Niqab is the face covering where the eyes are visible, but the rest of the face is covered. and abaya is the long robe. So would that be an appropriate thing for an Arabic teacher to do?
Well, what will be the difference is just showing pictures if she's showing how they dress. I think that's very religious. I will be very mindful of, I don't know, I will show pictures if it's part of her lesson, but to wear it, knowing that that's attached to religion, I will be very cautious of doing something like that.
Yeah, this is certainly a stickier one because you are using elements that have a deep religious significance for people. And depending on the teacher, him or herself, I assume it's her in this example, is that teacher a member of that culture and showing things that are part of her reality and her daily life? Or is it a teacher who's just showing cultural elements that are not related to her or her own practice? And definitely pictures would be a less controversial way to present those. Okay, and then the last one, a Chinese teacher has students make red lanterns for Lunar New Year. And as we don't have any, as I believe we don't have any Chinese teachers present with us in the room, I'm gonna skip this one because I don't have enough cultural understanding of the red lanterns to really talk to it confidently. So we'll just skip that one if you're okay with that. Okay, so as teachers, here are some questions we can ask ourselves to help us reflect on whether what we're doing is the best way to approach culture or not. So first, is the costume or image a stereotype of a group of people? So those teachers who showed up in their yearbook all dressed in the stereotypical Mexican clothing, which is not in fact commonly worn by Mexican people. Is that a stereotype, and is it, well, it is a stereotype. So had they asked themselves that, they might have said, maybe this isn't the best way to go. Does this object or image hold important cultural or traditional, and I think we can add to that, religious significance? And if it does, am I really the person to be representing that? Am I a member of that culture or religion? How does removing the context of this costume or object change its meaning? So for example, if we, well, let's think of an example of that one. Taking something out of context could be, I don't know. Do you have any examples that come to mind? Not thinking of any right off the top of my head. Do you have one, Beatrice?
Well, I was just thinking what Selena was saying. If we come dress up at something or show a picture or whatever, and it's not even related to the class that we're going to teach, the cultural thing. So I don't see the purpose of it. So if we remove it from the real context of, so it doesn't have any purpose.
Right, without explaining, without helping students get that deeper understanding of its significance.
Yeah, just because I get their dress as, I don't know, something, and then I don't even talk about it or teach about it, there's no purpose on doing that.
Right, so it just becomes a superficial exercise for fun, and is actually probably more damaging than helpful for students because they then get the wrong understanding or
distracted.
Yeah, yep. Okay, and then, so this was adapted. I added these last two, and I think we've talked about these a few times today. Am I clear about my role as a member or non-member of the target culture community? Because I think that changes the way that students perceive what's being offered to them, and it affects whether it's something that is being presented with a deep understanding and respect, or is something more superficial? And then, is there a better way to teach about this aspect of a target culture? And so I think that's really the question. If you're not sure and there's something that you're wanting to teach about, and you don't know whether it could be cultural appropriation to bring in a certain object or to dress a certain way, ask yourself, is there a better way? So like you suggested with the different articles of clothing, you could just as easily teach about them by showing images. Or about names, you can just as easily teach about those by embedding them in your activities rather than having students choose their own names.
Or we can look for videos of people from those countries or talking about that specific cultural aspect, and let a person that really knows about the culture explain or talk about it.
Absolutely. Or even better, if you're able to bring in members or representatives of a culture to share with students. If you are a teacher who's teaching about a culture that is not your own, then that's really a great thing to do for students, to bring it to life and to let them connect with someone and ask questions and learn more deeply about the culture. Okay, so if you want to kind of support your students in understanding what cultural appropriation is and how they might avoid it, this is a really nice resource from EdWeek that gives you some specific strategies for doing that. You can also walk them through kind of the same thing that we did today by looking at some examples that have come through media, and asking them what their reflections on it are. Maybe asking them to bring in examples from pop culture, from the artists and musicians that they like, and reflecting together on whether something is or is not appropriate. And then, because cultural appropriation has so much to do with power dynamics and equity, that it really can be a great springboard for talking to students about the power dynamics that are at play relating to your target culture, helping them understand the history that has played into those power dynamics. So it's a powerful tool to lead into those kind of deeper conversations. And then I just have a few resources for you. Some of these are where I pulled some of the information we went over today, but you're welcome to peruse these. I'll be posting this presentation to the World Languages page of the main DOE website, so you can find it there and you'll be able to click on the links. Are there any questions, thoughts, comments as we close today?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that when we teach a language, it's not that we just teach a language. I think we teach a whole new world. And why I say a whole new world is because as a human beings for different countries, we see things different sometimes, and it doesn't mean you are right, I'm wrong, or they're right. We teach them respect other cultures. We teach them and teach us to be very aware of differences, acceptance, kindness. It's not teaching just about languages and cultures. It's teaching about another way to see the world, another way to interact with each other. And we have a big responsibility for that. And doing the proper way can help us and them to learn a little bit more of each other.
Very beautifully said, Selena. I agree 100%. And talking about things like cultural appropriation can really open students up to that deeper benefit of studying a world language. Because as you said, it's not just about learning the language, although that is really important and can be a great thing to open doors for students. Some students will go on into their futures and they may use the language in their careers or personal lives, and others may not, but they all can take away with them that enormous benefit of understanding that the way I was raised and the culture that I'm steeped in is not the only one, and that there are many, many different ways of living and viewing the world, and that just that awareness that, oh, there are other ways, I think really leads students to be more tolerant, understanding, and well-rounded people, more empathetic people. Hopefully, I think that's what we're all aiming for, right? Yeah. Any other thoughts before we close? Okay, well then I thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to stop the recording if I can figure out how to do that.